As clinicians, we've spent thousands of hours to earn our license. Those thousands of hours included everything from learning the basics of anatomy and physiology to determining which test, drug, and procedure to use for almost any condition. We learned to treat all sorts of problems, no matter how big or small. But few of us were trained to identify or treat the underlying causes of these diseases in the first place. Using cutting-edge diagnostics and evidence-based treatments, adapt functional medicine practitioner training will teach you how to get to the root of your patient's health issues and improve them. You will learn exactly what tests to order, which supplements and protocols to use, and how to support your patient along the way. You'll have the opportunity to get your cases reviewed, to move well beyond theory, and learn how to practice functional medicine from day one. Current patient demand for functional medicine clinicians far exceeds the number of trained providers. Start your functional medicine training in the spring of this year. Get on the interest list at kresser.co/PTP. That's kresser.co/PTP. Get your own infrared sauna blanket or infrared PEMF mat at higherdose.com today and use my exclusive promo code Kresser15 at checkout to save 15% off site-wide. That's higherdose.com, exclusive promo code Kresser15. Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. This week I'm really excited to welcome Dr. David Perlmutter back to the show as a guest for, I believe, his third appearance. Dr. Perlmutter is a board-certified neurologist and fellow of the American College of Nutrition, and he is a frequent lecturer all around the world, serves as an associate professor at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine, five-time New York Times bestselling author and the recipient of numerous awards, including the Linus Pauling Award for his innovative approaches to neurological disorders. I always enjoy my conversations with Dr. Perlmutter, and this was no exception. We're going to be talking about his new book, which is provocatively titled Drop Acid. It's not what you think. The surprising new science of uric acid, the key to losing weight, controlling blood sugar, and achieving extraordinary health. So this is a book about metabolic function, which is something Dr. Perlmutter is an expert on and has written and talked about a lot, but in particular uric acid, which is a marker that I've always used for all new patients coming into the clinic, but is not typically looked at in the conventional paradigm. And we're going to talk about why uric acid is important, how those uric acid levels directly contribute to metabolic conditions, lifestyle and dietary considerations for lowering uric acid, how to test your uric acid levels at home, and what the proper ranges should be. So I think this is going to be a really useful and practical podcast for those of you who have metabolic issues or are concerned about metabolic health, because uric acid is a really kind of accessible marker that you can use to assess it. And as Dr. Perlmutter always does, he's going to provide some really practical strategies for what you can do about this. So really excited about this show. Without further ado, I bring you Dr. David Perlmutter. Dr. David Perlmutter, welcome back to the show. It's always such a pleasure to have you.
Dr. Chris Kresser, good to see you again. I'm glad you're looking so healthy.
Thank you. So when I heard, I can't remember, I think it was from you or one of the people on your team about your first book your next book called Drop Acid, I was definitely intrigued. And I thought for a second, your work was taking a totally different direction, one that I think we both are interested in, support, the idea of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, et cetera, but it's not exactly what, once I read the subtitle, I thought, oh, okay, I understand.
Okay. Well, I hope it wasn't too disappointing for you.
Not at all. I think this is, as I explained in the intro, I think uric acid, it's a marker that I have always included in my introductory blood panels for all of my patients for, over a decade of clinical practice. And it can be very revealing. And
Yes.
I think it's, as you're going to explain, it's one that's accessible, it's affordable to test, and it's quite meaningful, but it's also often ignored in the conventional medical paradigm. So
almost always.
Yeah. Why is that? Why do you think?
Well, you and I and everybody else learned about uric acid very specifically in the context of gout, pretty much end of story, maybe kidney stones, but that was really it. This is not your grandfather's uric acid anymore. We've now, over the past 2 decades, seen incredibly detailed research showing that Uric acid is not just this extracellular thing that crystallizes and makes your great toe hurt in gout, but it's actually playing a fundamental role, actually mechanistic role in so many of our really challenging metabolic issues that, my gosh, you talk about day in and day out. And now we have another very powerful tool, and that is reining in our uric acid if it's elevated. And it's elevated an awful lot these days in
Yes.
Western countries. The adults, uric acid levels are so much higher than they used to be. In America, for example, in the 1920s, the average uric acid level was 3.5 milligrams per deciliter. Now, adults in America, average level is 6. And, interestingly, that's still below what the lab or the doctor will tell
Normal.
you is normal.
Mhm.
And, I'm not, first of all, I don't want my patients to be normal in the normal range because they deserve optimal, A. And B, that number is derived from its relationship to gout. In other words, that's the number, the concentration of uric acid in the blood where crystallization begins to happen. And we know that the cardiometabolic issues, the raising of the blood pressure, raising of the blood sugar, the increased body fat, for example, that all happens a lot lower, like 5.5 being as much as we can really tolerate. So, this is research going on around the world. One article, interestingly, out of Japan is called, the title is Uric Acid in Metabolic Syndrome from Innocent Bystander to Central Player. And that's
Mhm.
really where we are now, that doesn't just happen to be elevated in insulin resistance and elevated blood pressure and hypertriglyceridemia, et cetera. It's playing a role in causing these problems. Well, that's worrisome on the one hand, but I look at that glass as half full because we can target it really easily. I'm sure that's something we'll talk about later on.
Absolutely. I just want to linger here for a moment because I think it's a really important concept. And of course, talked about it with other markers. But this difference between, quote, I'm doing air quotes here,
Air
normal
quotes.
range and optimal range for a particular marker. And you just hit on that with uric acid. And there's so many other examples from B12 to vitamin D to, just focusing on metabolic
Blood
issues. How about
sugar,
fasting insulin, fasting glucose?
you bet.
The range for fasting insulin goes up to what, 17, 18, sometimes even higher. And, folks like Peter Attia, myself, yourself probably want to see that more down in the 7, 8 or lower range. And so all of these ranges have been often designed to detect full-fledged disease,
That's right.
right? And we're not after that. We're after how do we prevent that disease in the first place. So why don't you, in the context of uric acid, just like a very basic overview of the physiology involved, like what is
Sure. Let me
uric
just
acid, what's it
comment, though.
doing?
I'll
Mhm.
do that. Let me just comment, though, on that topic that you just brought up because it's
Yeah,
so important that
yeah,
people realize that things like diabetes and hypertension and obesity, et cetera, these are, or the diseases that are derived from them, like coronary artery disease, Alzheimer's, cancer, type 2 diabetes, again, these are not binary issues. Really, the only binary issues that we know of are things like being pregnant, for example. You either
right.
are
You either are or you're not.
or you're not, or
Yeah.
or who know, there's very few binary issues in medicine. And to think that at 124 blood sugar, well, you're kind of up there, but you're not diabetic. And then at 125, all hell breaks loose because now you're diabetic, right?
Right.
And same thing with A1C, and so many of these metrics. Certainly, blood sugar. That's one that is really getting a lot more scrutiny as of late. Even a serum sodium and sodium consumption. These are things that are analog. That being a so-called pre-diabetic. Well, you're not actually diabetic with the word yet, air quotes, hanging in the background. That's 88 million Americans. And you add to that the 34 million who are already diabetic. But let's talk about those pre-diabetics. They're happy to say, oh, I'm not diabetic. They don't say the yet, but I'm not diabetic. And, we fall into this sense of security when we're not yet in a category. And certainly, gosh, hemoglobin A1C is such a great example of that, ideally we want our A1C around 5.2, maybe 5.3. And at 5.6, you're not diabetic, that's for sure. And watch television and everybody's jumping up and down because I got my A1C below 7.
Right.
That's terrible. An
Yeah.
A1C of 6.8, you're in big trouble at an A1C of 6.8 as it relates to metabolic problems and the downstream effects of those metabolic problems, like Alzheimer's being increased at an A1C of 5.8. I had to double click on that for just a moment because it's just that whole notion of either, of being so digital about whether you are or aren't is so unfair to people. And it does speak to the notion of being in the optimal range, not just in the normal. What is normal? It's
That's
average.
right.
Take a lot of
Average.
people, you check their whatever, and whatever that, standard deviation from the mean is, you say that you're in the normal range. Well, for people who are under the care of Dr. Chris Kresser, that's not good enough. And
Yeah.
and I praise you for getting that word out to people that we can do better. And that's how you prevent disease, is by dealing with what's best for you today, so that you're not going to be having troubles in 10 years, in 5 years, next week. Now, we've identified that uric acid is a really powerful new player at the table, and joins a blood sugar and fasting insulin and body mass index and blood pressure as a powerful metric by which we determine metabolic health. It's not that it happens to be elevated when people are hypertensive or have type 2 diabetes or are, I hate the term, pre-diabetic, because of, again, the sense of security, because I'm not diabetic yet. But it doesn't happen to be elevated in conjunction with those things. It is playing a causal role. And that's what's so exciting, because now that we've identified that, and again, this is 2 decades of research, now that we've identified it, we can target uric acid. There's so many things that we can do to help bring it down. And even before that, we can start to ask the question, gee, what is it that is causing uric acid to go up, in adults and children, adolescents especially, around the world? What has suddenly happened? And, this is the uric acid that directly relates to insulin resistance, and therefore increasing our risk of diabetes by raising our blood sugar right away today. It's the uric acid that directly targets various pathways that we'll talk about that raise blood pressure, that increase what's called lipogenesis, or the production of body fat. So there are many, many ways that this elevation of uric acid insinuates itself as a player. And you know what? The good news is now we know that. And now we can look at those things in each person, and in, population groups that are raising the uric acid. So I think the first place to start is, where is it coming from? What
Sure.
causes uric acid to be made in the body? And the easy part, in terms of taking the quiz that follows our time together today, is that it only comes from 3 sources: a special sugar called fructose, who knew, alcohol, and a chemical that we get from certain foods called purines. And purines are, in the foods that we eat, the breakdown products of the DNA and the RNA that are in the cells of the food that we eat. Reality is that most of the purines in our body actually don't come from food, but actually come from the normal wear and tear breakdown of our tissues that we always engage in, especially if we're vigorously exercising. Alcohol, we know where that comes from. And fructose, well, I think a lot of people may not know where that comes from. That's in over 60% of the packaged foods sold in America's grocery stores, added to those foods to make them sweeter. Why? Because you and I and everybody else walking the planet likes sweet. Our desire for sweet is a powerful survival mechanism, because it does several things. It identifies foods that are safe, because by and large, foods that are toxic would never be sweet. It identifies foods that are at the maximum level of their nutritional advantage. And finally, it has served us to indicate that winter is coming.
Mm.
Basically, fruits ripen in the late
Yeah.
summer, early fall, the wild blueberries that our ancestors may have found. And it's a signal to make fat. This fructose, metabolized into uric acid, basically tells our bodies winter is coming, and you better get ready for it. And Interestingly, our metabolism of fructose into this danger signal called uric acid, that story begins some 14 to 17 million years ago, long before, Homo sapiens or any of our Homo group
Hominids.
were even
Hmm.
around. Primates experienced some selection pressure because over about 1 million years, that's an awful long time for us to think about, in terms of Homo sapiens, but the world began to cool. And as the world cooled, there was less and less food. And any selective advantage would lead to more likelihood of survival. And one selective advantage was making more fat. And I'm not saying that, we selected or nature selected for fatter primates, but just a little bit more fat would allow them to survive during times of food scarcity. And the mechanism is a mutation or series of mutations in an enzyme called uricase. So the enzyme that breaks down uric acid, and we lost it. We lost the ability to break down uric acid, and that was a powerful survival advantage for us, our primate ancestors, our Paleolithic ancestors, and we have that same uricase mutation today, whereby we don't break it down, and our uric acid levels are 4 to 5 times higher than the uric acid levels of other mammals. So we have this elevated uric acid right now globally that's being targeted by suddenly a change in the environment that's signaling the body to make fat, store fat, increase blood sugar production so we can power our brains, increase our blood pressure as a hedge against dehydration. But we're targeting that pathway 365 days a year. And what are we seeing? Dramatic increased rates of obesity. Right now, as we have this conversation, 1/3 of American adults is obese. That's not just overweight, but obese. And that number in the distant future, in 2030, that's obviously the distant future from now, that'll be 50%. Means
Yeah,
1 in 2 American adults won't just be overweight, needing to drop a few pounds, but by BMI will be obese.
I think the
And
pandemic may have even accelerated that timeline from what I've read in terms of the weight amount of weight gain that has
that's
happened
right.
during the
And,
pandemic.
when we talk about a pandemic, I mean, this is a global issue, obviously, with the globalization of the Western diet and lifestyle. And I think clearly when we realize that the number one death on our planet right now is not some viral entity. It is a group of diseases called the chronic degenerative conditions,
Yeah,
which are underpinned by problems of our metabolism and are therefore related to our lifestyle choices. So we are choosing to make these chronic metabolic degenerative conditions the number one cause of death on our planet. And it plays into COVID death, as you well know. I mean,
absolutely.
metabolic
Yeah,
issues, you end up in the hospital with diabetes or hypertension or obesity, and your chances of a bad outcome are dramatically
yeah,
increased. And when you recognize the connection of elevated uric acid to those very problems, the hypertension, the diabetes, or at least insulin resistance, the increase in body fat, you might think, gee, I wonder if there's an increased risk of bad outcome just based on uric acid. And you'd be right.
mm,
That one recent Chinese study showed that when they measured uric acid in people coming into the hospital, if your uric acid level was in the highest group or quartile, your risk of ending up in the ICU, ending up on a ventilator, or ending up dead was increased as much as threefold. So that's an attention grabber, isn't it, as it relates to uric acid?
absolutely. And I again want to reflect on something you said because I think it's really important concept for people to understand and something we've both talked about a lot. This power of looking through the evolutionary lens to understand these mechanisms where you have an adaptation that occurred in this case millions of years ago that was adaptive to the people living at that in that or the in this case animals and eventually maybe early hominids that were living at that time in that place in that particular set of circumstances where food scarcity was a much bigger problem than food abundance.
That's
And
right.
now we have that same genetic biological programming, but we're living in an environment where of course food scarcity for some people around the world is still an issue, but in the developed world food abundance is by far the bigger threat that we face. And yet we still have this biological machinery that is essentially tuned to protect us from food scarcity. So
Yeah, I laugh because I used basically that terminology in an article I wrote about this topic half a century ago. I published it in the Miami Herald in 1971, long before I think you were born. Correct me if I'm
wow,
wrong.
3 years
And
before I was born.
okay, there you go. And I asked that question. I said, that evolution is not keeping up with these changes that we're experiencing. And the final sentence was, but what about us living today with the outdated machinery? Exactly the interestingly the
Yep.
words that you talked about. And it's true that we call this an evolutionary environmental mismatch, that we're living in an environment that just isn't suited to our heritage. We can't change yet necessarily our genome, at least in terms of its hardwiring, but we sure as heck can change the environment. In other words, what influences our physiology and plays upon our genome by perhaps emulating many of the lifestyle events of our ancestors. That's what the so-called paleo movement is all about, which is interesting because that's the last time I actually saw you.
Yeah.
Was at a paleo
In
kind of a
person.
conference.
Right.
But it's our genes allowed us to survive for 99.9% of our time on this planet under a given set of circumstances, which have suddenly, in the blink of an eye, changed. And now we're seeing that even longevity is declining prior to COVID. I mean, that's
Yeah.
when it started. So COVID certainly sped things up, but we've burned the candle at both ends for too long, and we've gotten past the advantages offered by modern technology to the extent that we are now losing ground.
That's
And
right.
when we look at something like all-cause mortality, there's an interesting study that came out of Japan, published in 2009, and they looked at 90,000 people, 42,000 men, 48,000 women, and they followed them for 8 years. And they looked at all-cause mortality in comparison to what their uric acid levels were at the beginning of the
Hmm.
study. And what they found was that people with the highest uric acid, above 7, had a 16% increased risk of dying from anything whatsoever. They had a remarkable 39% increased risk of cardiovascular mortality, dying of a heart-related event, a 35% increased risk of dying of a stroke, and interestingly, an 8 to 13% increased risk of death for every point of uric acid greater than 7.
Which gives us a
You know,
lot more confidence in the findings, that monotonic relationship that just keeps going up as the uric acid goes up.
that's right. And, these are correlative studies. They correlate having a high uric acid to increased risk of death. But I take that information just as another interesting sidelight in terms of, yes, in addition, we understand the mechanisms by which uric acid is able to do that.
Now more than ever, we need our immune systems to be firing on all cylinders. And as you probably know, vitamin C is one of the most important nutrients for proper immune function. Sadly, most people don't get enough vitamin C in their diet. And while some do take multivitamins with C or individual vitamin C supplements, those aren't always a great choice either. Many vitamin C supplements contain synthetic forms of vitamin C. GMOs. Most vitamin C in pills is made from GMO corn syrup. Sugar, toxic fillers and flow agents, which can cause inflammation and gut issues, and allergens like soy, corn, or food coloring. This is why I recommend whole food forms of vitamin C, which contain the full spectrum of vitamin C activity without GMOs or other junk. And my favorite whole food vitamin C product is Essential C from Paleo Valley. I love that Paleo Valley is dedicated to using the highest quality ingredients. All of their products are ethically sourced, grain-free, soy-free, dairy-free, non-GMO, and contain nothing synthetic. And their Essential C complex is no different. It's made with 3 of the most potent vitamin C-rich superfoods on the planet, one of which is 120 times more potent than an orange. Nothing synthetic, no weird questionable ingredients, just whole food. So you can be confident you're feeding your immune system what it needs to stay strong through whatever 2022 holds. And right now they're offering my community an exclusive 15% off discount. I've been working with the team at Paleo Valley for a long time, and I can tell you this is the biggest discount they ever offer, and it's only available for a limited time. Just go to paleovalley.com/Chris and use the code Kresser15 to get 15% off. Let's go back to the what produces your uric acid. So you mentioned fructose, alcohol, and purines. Let's dive a little bit deeper on fructose and alcohol in particular. So fructose is found, as many of the listeners will know, both in highly processed and refined foods like sugar sweetened beverages, soda, all kinds of packaged foods that you wouldn't even expect it to be in necessarily,
Right.
that they just put it in, but it's also found in fruit and whole fruits that people might eat. So what level of fructose and let's say form of fructose intake do you feel is problematic when it comes to uric acid levels? Are we only talking about the highly refined sources of fructose? Are we also talking about whole fruit? Does it depend on the person and their metabolic status? What's your position
Well,
on
to be
that?
fair, everything depends on the person to some degree, right? Because we're all
Yeah,
different. But the issues with fructose, fructose isn't a question of whether it's refined or not refined. It is chemically fructose. It's a thing. The main issues are the amount of fructose you are consuming and over what period of time.
right.
So that's why there's an advantage of eating fruit as opposed to drinking a glass of fruit juice. If you drink a glass of fruit juice, generally that happens quickly, or you drink a soda, that happens really quickly. And the amount of fructose in a glass of fruit juice or soda is dramatic. I mean, when we're looking at 36 grams of sugar, and by and large, table sugar is 50% fructose, but a lot
Mm,
of what goes in, at least to sodas, is something called high fructose corn syrup, and that has more fructose than glucose. So normally table sugar, sugar 50-50 sucrose, but this is a modification such that there's even more fructose. Why? Because fructose is sweeter than glucose, so you don't have to use as much. It is cheaper, right? So that's obviously the bottom line that food manufacturers, think about that term for a moment, food manufacturers.
should be an
Kidding
oxymoron,
me?
right?
It is an oxymoron. But that's what they are using because it's really cheap since the advent of the technology in 1958, University of Oklahoma, of making this sugar out of corn. But it really didn't take off until the 1970s. But now, it's everywhere. And it goes by so many other names, fructose, or the various names of sugar, that I can't blame people for not understanding that these bizarre names on the label that you've never heard of before, but they're just changing the name and getting away with it. But that said, that's always an argument against eating packaged foods anyway and shopping the periphery of the grocery store. But having said that, so, getting back to fruit, we talked about the quantity, and, there's not that much fructose or sugar in fruit. An apple might have 5, maybe even 10 grams of sugar in it, but that isn't something you drink right down. You eat an
Right.
apple, it's going to take you some time.
Yeah.
So it's not a sudden surge of fructose. B, the fiber in the apple is going to slow the fructose absorption. So again, the presentation of fructose to your physiology, specifically its absorption and then transport to the liver, is slowed. C, what does C stand for? Vitamin C.
Mm,
Vitamin C is long been known to be very helpful in treating gout, high uric
yeah.
acid, because it aids in the excretion of uric acid at the level of the kidney. And D would be the bioflavonoids, meaning that fruit contains a suite of bioflavonoids, depending on the fruit. And some of them, particularly luteolin and quercetin in particular, target the actual enzyme called xanthine oxidase, which is also targeted by the gout drug called allopurinol. So nature provides ways for us to dump our uric acid and even reduce the production of uric acid in our bodies if we avail ourselves of these really
Mm.
great tools. And therefore, to answer that very important question, I don't think I have done a podcast that question hasn't been asked. And it is, fruit is okay. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. 5 apples a day, the doctor you will pay. So, in moderation. Same
Right.
thing with vegetables. There are some vegetables that are actually high in purines. and therefore you would think you should avoid because they might raise uric acid. And these vegetables have been on the don't eat list as it relates to gout for an awful long time, just because they're high in purines, like the cruciferous vegetables and mushrooms and things like that. Turns out that they are associated with decreased uric acid. Again, many of the same mechanisms, especially quercetin and the other bioflavonoids that help reduce the formation of uric acid in the first place. The other source of purines are the organ meats like liver and kidney, and small, concentrated, very cellular types of animal products like sardines and mussels and scallops. Doesn't mean you can't have them. It means you should know what your uric acid level is. And then, if I'm eating a lot of liver, that might be something that I should literally take off the plate. But you have to get a sense as to where you are in this whole discussion and then make the modifications. I mean, I think most people who are paying attention to all that you are teaching really get that they shouldn't be eating a lot of sugar, and
Yeah.
probably understand quite clearly that fructose is something to avoid. But I think the purine part of that story might be somewhat new to many people.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, as it relates to alcohol, it really depends. It depends on what kind of alcohol you're drinking. Hard liquor is associated with increased uric acid. Wine is pretty much neutral in men and actually is associated with decreased uric acid in women. But the worst player of all is beer. And tough for me to say that right now during playoff season, but nonetheless, beer is, you get beer, it gets you on two accounts. Number one, the alcohol, but number two, beer is exceedingly high in purines because of the yeast that is used to make beer, the brewer's yeast. And interestingly, this whole notion of uric acid and metabolic health, Japan, I've already quoted 2 studies from Japan. They're way ahead of us on understanding why, A, it's important, and B, what we can do about it. So they've already started marketing non-purine beer because they know that beer is a huge resource for people to raise their uric acid and hence give them problems. So because of the alcohol and the purines, we now understand where the beer belly is actually coming from. That beverage is telling that body, get ready for winter, get ready for food scarcity, make fat, and raise your blood sugar to power your brain.
Yeah. Well, the phrase beer belly came from somewhere, right? It's clear that has a like you said, a double whammy effect when it comes to uric acid, and I think also just weight gain in general. Heal at home or on the go with Higher Dose's infrared therapy line. Experience the powerful benefits of infrared with Higher Dose's portable infrared sauna blanket and feel the difference after just one session. Infrared increases blood flow for faster recovery, better sleep, and a calmer central nervous system. Plus, it naturally releases a dose of happy chemicals in the brain, leaving you feeling euphoric. The sauna blanket has an amethyst layer to deepen benefits of infrared, a tourmaline layer that generates negative ions, a charcoal layer to bind to pollutants and amplify the detoxification process, and a clay layer which is balancing for the heat. If you don't have the budget or the space for a full-size sauna, this sauna blanket pays for itself in a few sessions and is a game changer. Check out higherdose.com today and use my exclusive promo code Kresser15 at checkout to save 15% off site-wide. That's higherdose.com, exclusive promo code Kresser15. So that's helpful to break down for folks, because I know a lot of people have those specific questions of like, okay, should I avoid all fructose, meaning no fruit whatsoever? Or, just avoid the larger hits of fructose from like sugar sweetened beverages, fruit juice, and the stuff that is included. And as you said, of course, it will depend on the person. But in my experience as a clinician, most people are able to tolerate 1 or 2 servings of fruit a day, especially if they're the lower sugar fruits like blueberries or raspberries or something like that in the context of a whole foods diet. I wanted to
and leave the skin on if ever you can, like for
right.
apples,
Don't
for
peel
example.
them all, as much fiber as you can get with them
Yeah, and
naturally.
also that's where many of the bioflavonoids. I mean,
Right.
mom used to say that that's where all the vitamins are, but She was close, right? But
Yeah.
there are other things going on in the skin that are really
Yeah.
important for us. But
Yeah.
let me make it just a little bit more difficult, because I think everybody's
Okay.
got everything now.
Yeah.
It's
That my
alcohol,
audience
purines,
likes that. They like the nuance. So
sure,
let's bring
alcohol,
it on.
purines, and fructose. A little more complicated in that our bodies manufacture fructose as a survival mechanism, because once that happens, once we trigger the body to make fructose, it goes on to make things like body fat and raise our blood pressure and increase our production of glucose, gluconeogenesis. And so the question should be asked, then what would cause our body to activate this polyol pathway and convert glucose, blood sugar, into fructose? Well, what might that survival inputs be that would cause us to need to do that? And one very powerful thing that'll turn that pathway on is dehydration. Meaning, how does our body know when we can't find water? What happens? Well, when we get dehydrated, our serum sodium goes up. That's the first marker. It turns out that elevated serum sodium triggers this polyol pathway to make fructose, because fructose turns on uric acid to make fat. Well, why would we want to make fat if we can't find water? What would be the advantage of that? And to answer that question, I'd like everybody who's listening to us right now to think of this incredible animal that can walk across the desert, and it's the camel. And what is its unique identifying characteristic? It has this big hump on its back. Well, if you look inside the hump, you're not going to find, a couple of gallons of water. What you find is fat. The reason it has fat and can survive the desert without drinking water is because when we metabolize fat, we convert it into two things: carbon dioxide that we exhale and water. We make metabolic water when we burn fat as a fuel. So when we are facing dehydration, our serum sodium goes up, we make fructose turn to uric acid, we increase our production of body fat, we make a little bit more water, and that was, in the day, a survival mechanism. Now, the problem with that pathway today is that we can jump our serum sodium levels in a heartbeat by eating salt. So when you're watching the playoffs and you've now decided you're not going to drink beer, but you sit down with a bag of pretzels that are salted, immediately your serum sodium goes up. Your body activates the polyol pathway. You produce more fructose, and all of the downstream negative things happen, even though you're not eating fructose, because you've made more fructose in your body. And as such, your body thinks it's dehydrated, makes more fat, raises your blood pressure so that you can make sure that you get blood supply to your organs. And it creates a survival mechanism, survival scenario that you do not need. You don't need more fat because you're sitting on the couch watching the playoffs or whatever you're doing. My
Right.
point is that, and people are eating so much sodium. We've known for 3 decades that higher salt consumption is related to dramatic increased risk for diabetes, for obesity, and certainly, everybody gets the memo on this one, hypertension or increased blood pressure. But the exact mechanisms whereby this was happening have remained elusive until we've started to understand what's going on with uric acid, what's going on with the kidney, the role of inflammation in the kidney brought on by this whole experience, and then what's the ultimate payoff for us in understanding it. We can make better recommendations. And it may be as simple as, look, I know you're going to eat that bag of chips. I can't stop you, but do me one favor, or do yourself a favor. After you do that, drink 2 glasses of water. Immediately, you dilute down your sodium and you stop activating this mechanism. And to be sure, this mechanism is profound. This activation of the polyol pathway that converts glucose into sorbitol and sorbitol into fructose even happens in the brain.
Mhm.
And a recent study demonstrated that the levels of these intermediates, sorbitol and fructose, are 4 to 5 times higher in the Alzheimer's brain in comparison to age-matched non-Alzheimer's patients. What is it telling us? It's telling us that this powerful pathway is activated in the Alzheimer's brain. And why might that be? It might be because we know one other thing is dramatically elevated in the Alzheimer's brain, and that is glucose. When glucose is elevated, it forces that pathway along to ultimately make fructose. And fructose is actually something that the brain can metabolize and then can metabolize into uric acid. Now, that may have offered some survival advantage in the past, but certainly today, by compromising the brain's energetics, because the uric acid damages the brain's energy factories called the mitochondria, that's not going to play out well for people today. We know that fundamentally in the Alzheimer's brain that the mitochondria aren't working well, the cells can't make energy, and ultimately they perish for lack of being able to use fuel.
Absolutely. And, I just was thinking a few times as you were talking, it's so much just goes back to eating real food. What you said, the periphery of the grocery store, and, starting from looking at whole fruit and all the compounds in whole that are other compounds in whole fruit that mitigate or against the potential harm of fructose. And then you can say a similar thing for organ meats, or they're very high in certain nutrients, but they're also high in other nutrients that help offset those nutrients that could potentially be an issue. And of course, they can still be an issue. I mean, if you have
Sure.
excess uric acid, you don't want to be eating a lot of liver. If you have high iron levels, you also don't want to be eating a lot of liver because it's so concentrated in iron. But I'm just continually struck by the wisdom of nature in that respect, where if a food is high in something else, it almost always has counterbalancing mechanisms in the form of other nutrients. Whereas when you're eating stuff that has been manufactured, manufactured food,
Right.
that's rarely taken, if ever, taken into consideration. You're only getting, jacked up levels of a particular compound without any of those other balancing factors. And I sometimes
And it's
people,
it's
it
even
seems
how
so
it's created. You're right. I mean,
absolutely.
I'm gonna go to the health food store. That's a good thing, and I'm gonna have a great big glass of fresh squeezed organic, uh, created by
Fair trade.
shamans, whatever, carrot
Yeah.
juice, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm watching them make my carrot juice. You hear this sound. The carrots are
Mhm.
going through, and this gorgeous orange juice is
Right.
trickling out,
Bright
and we'll
color,
put a
good
shot of
smell.
something in it just to
Yeah.
and then make it a different name. But what do? Once they make your carrot juice, two important things happen. First, there's a byproduct, which is all that horrible stuff, that sinewy, fibery stuff that they throw in the garbage, right? The second thing that's created is this juice that gives you a very powerful slug of sugar right now. And in the context of our ancestors, they didn't juice carrots or they didn't juice anything. And the hunter gatherers aren't going to find cartons of Tropicana hanging from trees when they were hunting and gathering. Hunting and gathering isn't hunting down a convenience store and gathering up the Doritos. It really, you're right. Nature has incredible wisdom here. And that's why if people want to do something with a carrot, by all means, use some kind of machine that saves the fiber, for crying out loud, because that's it's not just this, it's not sawdust. It's really important for you. That's where there's so much nutrition. We didn't mention, but the microbiome as well thrives when it gets that fiber. When you just drink the juice and depleted of that fiber, oh my gosh, your gut bacteria, so they're going, yes, carrots. They're watching it and they're going, oh no, they're throwing out the fiber. And then they don't work as aggressively in maintaining your gut lining or manufacturing B vitamins or neurotransmitters or targeting the expression of your DNA, for crying out loud. So we've got to nurture our gut bacteria. It turns out this is interestingly quite related to uric acid. We know that higher levels of uric acid favors the overgrowth of extremely pro-inflammatory strains of bacteria. And interestingly, several studies have demonstrated that in patients with gout, by and large a situation of very high uric acid, that a crazy technique called fecal microbial transplant, whereby a stool specimen from somebody without gout, who's relatively normal, is transplanted into the colon of a gout patient, and they have a dramatic reduction in the frequency and severity of their gout attacks. So, saying to us that the gut bacteria have a role to play in uric acid metabolism as well. And we know that one of the ways uric acid is excreted is through the gut. Primarily, it's from the kidney. So, this notion that we make our own fructose, I think is something that needs, a little further unpacking moving forward, because you can be on a great program not eating fructose in any way, shape, or form, and yet you're still making uric acid through the fructose pathway because, for example, you have sleep apnea. Think about that. When blood oxygen saturation goes down, and there are plenty of instances these days where that is happening, but if it happens because of sleep apnea, which is not unusual, then that turns on this polyol pathway and your body feels like it needs to make more fructose to make more fat and ultimately more glucose. So who has sleep apnea? Well, generally, these are people who are overweight, and as such, then they are put in a situation where they're even gaining more weight, making their sleep apnea worse. So
Right.
becomes a
Vicious cycle.
very vicious cycle, feed forward, no pun intended, sure, event.
Why not?
Yeah, why not? And so I think it's, what we laid out in Drop Acid is the science that I think is so important to understand, to get your arms. Yeah, you can read the studies that show lowering uric acid is good for X, Y, and Z, but when you get how these pathways are working, number one, and number two, as you mentioned earlier, when you look at it from a historical perspective and an evolutionary perspective, you realize that these things allowed us to survive. We say, oh, insulin resistance is a terrible thing, right? It's always, well, what do we do to keep ourselves from becoming insulin resistant? Actually, it's context dependent. Insulin resistance is a wonderful thing if you are facing starvation. Insulin resistance is what you need to happen if you're a bear getting ready to hibernate, for example. You dramatically want to be insulin resistant so that you have a higher blood sugar and can make more body fat. So you're going to survive for the X number of months that you're sleeping in the cave or hibernating. So it's really, something to think about in terms of taking a step back, because we'd love to say, oh, elevated blood sugar is necessarily a bad thing. Well, no, it's not. If you're starving and you're activating pathways to make more blood sugar, it'll power your brain and allow you to be clever enough to avoid two things: starvation and predation, being eaten by other animals in the hunter-gatherer days. So, having increased gluconeogenesis is a good thing. That takes us to a very interesting switch, if you will, that we are either telling our bodies that we're feasting or it's a time of famine, that either the hunting is good or the hunting is bad. If the hunting is good, we're activating something called AMP kinase, meaning we're telling our physiology we don't need to make fat, we've got plenty of food. We don't need to make blood sugar. We got plenty of sugar being made, and we're eating it. We really want to keep our AMP kinase part of this metabolism activated. And the alternative is activating another way that AMP is dealt with, called AMP deaminase, another pathway. That's the famine pathway. That's saying to your physiology, no food. Whatever we get, we better turn down the metabolism, stop burning calories, shut down the mitochondria from working, and make as much fat as we possibly can. And at the same time, we sure as heck better make more blood sugar so that we can power our brain so we can get out of this mess. That's AMP deaminase. Or if you're getting ready to hibernate for the next 4 months. I don't know many people who actually these days I
Better rephrase that. Yeah, maybe we do.
But hibernation is a time when you shut your metabolism basically off.
Completely
your blood
down.
sugar goes up, and you're going to burn your body fat. But in getting ready for hibernation, you're making as much fat as you possibly can.
Yeah.
So these are the two pathways. Do we want to be AMP kinase, or do we want to be AMP deaminase? Do we want to tell our bodies the hunting is good, we don't need to store fat, Or do we tell our bodies, whoa, we're not going to have food coming up. We better make as much fat as we can. And it turns out that uric acid helps make that decision.
Hmm.
At higher levels of uric acid, shut down AMP kinase. It's about the worst thing we would want to do. We want that AMP kinase to be lit up. And one of the reasons we exercise is that's a powerful activator of AMP kinase. It's why we take berberine or quercetin. They're AMP kinase activators. It's why people take a drug called metformin if they're diabetic. Activates AMP kinase and tells the liver, hey, we don't need to keep making glucose because we have enough.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, when uric acid is elevated, AMP kinase gets shut down and we activate a totally different pathway, this AMP deaminase, that we need to override. So we need to get uric acid under control. Fundamentally, that's the big fundamental right there. That pathway, which way you going here? Are you going to be lean and mean, or are you getting ready to hibernate and building as much body fat as you can so that you can go and,
live off your fat stores for a long time.
We talk about hibernation and fat storage, but you think about the hummingbird, for example. The hummingbird can have as much as 40% of its body weight fat because it makes this epic 1,000, 2,000 mile journey. A hummingbird. So it's one of the fattest animals on the planet when it's getting ready for this trip, though you don't look at it and say, oh, it's fat, but it's got a lot of body fat. And what does it drink prior to this epic trip? If you want hummingbirds in your backyard, you get a hummingbird feeder and you fill it with sugar water, right? That's what nectar is. It's sugar. And they do that to gain body fat so that they'll have a resource for calories and water. Remember, burning fat makes water. Whales have so much fat because they need the energy, of course, but they don't stop along the way because they find an underwater water fountain and can drink fresh water. They do not drink fresh water. They may get some fresh water from, if they eat plankton, for example, or krill. But by and large, they're making what's called metabolic water. And you remember the camel story that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, this is so fascinating. And I think anyone who's been listening carefully knows they need to get their uric acid under control and manage it. Earlier, we talked about the fact that the lab, if you go into your primary care physician, you get a blood draw and it says normal, you can't necessarily accept or trust that is an optimal result for your uric acid. So let's talk a little bit about testing options first. It sounds like there are some at-home testing options for people who don't have access to testing through their doctor. But either way, what is the optimal range in your mind for uric acid?
Well, let me just go back a little bit. And, typically for people who go to their doctor and then want to know, well, I had a blood test last week. Can you tell me? And they'll get a call from the nurse who would say, oh,
it's all normal.
It was normal.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, what was the value? No, it was fine. Nothing to worry about. Why in the world would you need to know? I mean, who the heck are you? Actually, I'm wearing a continuous glucose monitor because I really want to know.
Yeah.
But anyhow, that's usually the most you get. But nowadays people can sign on to their portal and get the actual data. And again, the lab printout is going to say in the normal range, which is anything below 7. Remember, that has to do with gout. We want uric acid levels at 5.5 milligrams per deciliter or lower. Now, that is knowing your uric acid level or what it may have been might be as simple as a phone call or logging onto your portal because it's typically included in your annual blood work. But as you mentioned earlier, you can go online and buy a uric acid monitor. In fact, we may have sent you one as well.
You did, yeah.
Good. And it's a simple finger stick. People have been doing that kind of thing for years to check their blood sugar at home. Even strangely enough, non-diabetics, who knew? But you can, here's my monitor right here. It's what it looks like. You do a finger stick. Here's my most recent level. I don't know if you can see that, 4.7.
Yep.
But there's nothing to it. And it's nothing you have to do every day. You can do it every 2 weeks. You can do it every 4 weeks. But then, the implementation.
One question, how labile is uric acid as a marker? So in other words, how quickly will your diet and lifestyle choices impact the levels?
Very aggressively and very quickly to certain things. And let's talk about that for just a moment. Really interesting study out of Oxford looked at 22 young men with mild elevation of their uric acid and one intervention, no dietary changes or other lifestyle changes, but it was a placebo-controlled trial. They either took a placebo. I wonder if that placebo was a sugar pill. That would not be fair, right? Or they took quercetin, 500 milligrams a day. Their uric acid levels in the quercetin group dropped 8% in 2 weeks. So it can come down significantly. If you go on a long run today, longer than normal, and maybe pick up your pace a little bit, your uric acid level might well come up half a point tomorrow because of the breakdown of the proteins in your body forming purines, and through that mechanism. If you fast for a day or two, your uric acid will transiently go up. But I think, that's the value of being able to test. You don't want to really hang your hat on what it's doing moment to moment. You want to look at the trends. You want to,
Yeah.
have a few variables like this week I really concentrated on whatever it may be, on eliminating hidden sources of fructose from my diet. Oh, and by the way, 2 variables. I also added in some quercetin, 500 milligrams a day. I'll check it in a week or two, and you'll see that it will most likely come down. So, it is something that you end up following along with all the other cool things that we get to follow: the length of time we slept, the quality of our sleep, our continuous glucose measurements, our pulse rate when we're running, how many minute miles we're doing right now, all the things that are really important to follow. Glucose monitoring, I think, is hugely valuable. But uric acid's right up there with all these things. Now that we know its role in metabolic disturbances. Now, let me give you a sneak preview, because this is news as of yesterday, and the blog that I'm writing, actually, I started this morning.
Great.
Polycystic ovarian syndrome affects between 4 and 13 to 18% of women who can
Childbearing
be
age.
fertile
Hmm.
in America. And it is an endocrine/metabolic disorder. Extremely common, described as being the most common cause of infertility in North American women. But it's not just as it relates to menstruation and having cysts on the ovaries, which actually isn't necessary for the diagnosis. It's an endocrine issue characterized by significant increase in androgenic hormones like testosterone in comparison to estrogenic type hormones, and also characterized by metabolic issues like elevated blood sugar, insulin resistance, especially. And it is because of that I began studying that, because these metabolic issues that these women experience, they may have the full-blown metabolic syndrome. Well, in my study over the past couple of years, metabolic issues lights up something called uric acid in my mind. Could there be a relationship between elevated uric acid and PCOS? And it turns out that women with PCOS have dramatically higher uric acid levels. Is it cause or is it effect? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know that having elevated uric acid is giving women these issues. But in the studies, it looks like when you control for diabetes and you control for elevated body weight, for example, that even when you do so, the uric acid levels are still elevated. So this bears evaluation, that especially women with PCOS, and I know I'm talking to a lot of people right now, that by all means get your uric acid level checked. And what's the harm in engaging in some activities to lower your uric acid? Because it's really the metabolic issues that are paramount here, the endocrine as well, with the troubles menstruating, amenorrhea and dysmenorrhea. But the endocrine issues are the long-term life-threatening issues, because they pave the way for heart disease and Alzheimer's and cancer and diabetes. So I would say that sneak peek here is to understand, especially in PCOS, what the uric acid level is. And there's nothing wrong with engaging this program that we're talking about and helping to drive that uric acid level down.
I imagine that's really important as well for women who are at risk for gestational diabetes, which
You
is
bet.
a
No,
growing
that's a
concern.
classic. If they manage to become pregnant, risk of gestational diabetes is far increased. Risk of not carrying, of prematurity, is increased, and risk of miscarriage is dramatically increased as well. And I don't know yet the role of uric acid in those issues that accompany risk in PCOS. But I'm going to look into it because I think it's really fascinating. This is a large number of people.
Absolutely. And it's a large and growing number of people, and really a huge threat to humanity.
To fecundity, you're right.
Yeah. So, Dr. Perlmutter, this is really fascinating. I think it's a potential game changer for a lot of people. And what I love about it too is it's pretty, once you get the basic science down, it's pretty simple and easy to understand. You have a single marker that you're tracking, of course, potentially with other markers that you're hopefully paying some attention to. But people are often pretty overwhelmed, just in general, but especially since the pandemic. And so having something like this that is relatively simple and straightforward, it's affordable to track with the home testing, like you mentioned. And there are some simple strategies that they can use that are outlined in your book, some of which we talked about and some of which we haven't. Dietary strategies, some supplements that can be helpful. I just think we need more of these kinds of simple, accessible, practical strategies. So it's really excited
I'm glad you
to
didn't
learn
say
about
hacks. I don't like that word.
I'm not. You know me. I'm not.
I'm loving the word strategy.
I'm not in the biohack camp. Although I have an appreciation for some of that. But yeah, just simple strategies and tools that become part of your normal routine. That's the problem I have with hacks. Is like we need to make this stuff second nature, just things that we do to live a good life, nothing more than that, just really effective steps that we take to improve our health and our well-being. So
my goal is to work bottom up, and in other words, direct to consumer. Certainly that is a technique that the drug companies have really
mastered.
Works exceedingly well. But informing people that they will then say to their doctors, hey, by the way, I may have read the book or I saw the podcast, whatever, and I'd like to know my uric acid. And most of the time, unfortunately, I think what the response is going to be, well, why would you care? You don't have gout. So that's the one approach. But I think the top-down approach as well, that I wrote this book after reviewing close to 500 peer-reviewed references so that our medical colleagues can understand that, this has been research going on around the world for 20 years plus.
Yeah.
The first book on this topic, looking at uric acid apart from gout, was written in 1898
Wow.
by Dr. Alexander Haig. And it was uric acid in relation to cognitive decline, depression, all kinds of other issues. So, it's worth looking at. And the simplest thing anybody can do is to Google two words, metabolic and uric. You don't want to Google metabolism because then you get uric acid metabolism, but metabolic and uric. And your screen will light up with wonderful peer-reviewed research studies from around the world that have been talking about this for so very long. And now it's available to each and every one of us. And as you well said, getting it under control is not challenging. It's not something exotic. I mean, these are the foods to eat. These are the foods to avoid. Here's why sleep is important. Here's what you should know about exercise. And here's how you can measure it. It's pretty much for people who've been following you for the past several years, understand that it's just empowerment. It's just knowing more about yourself so you can be your own advocate and chart your own health destiny.
Excellent. So where can people learn about the book and pick up a copy?
Well, the book is called Drop Acid, and oddly enough, the website is dropacidbook.com. And that's a good place to start, or just drperlmutter.com, my website, and we have plenty of links to it. There's a great new YouTube video that we just put on YouTube talking about the metabolic issues that are related to elevated uric acid. But I would say dropacidbook.com.
Great. And I'm excited to share this with the clinicians that we train and the health coaches as well. I think it's important information for all health professionals, like you said, to be aware of, in addition to just individuals who are trying to improve their health. So always enjoy our conversations, Dr. Perlmutter. Thanks for this important contribution.
Thank you, Dr. Kresser.
Look forward to, good luck with the book, and look forward to our next conversation.
As well. Thanks again.
Okay, everybody, thanks for listening. Keep sending your questions to chriskresser.com/podcast question. We'll talk to you next time. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/Chris Kresser or facebook.com/Chris Kresser LAC. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.